So we've added or created, in this case, our weather API interface, and I said that this is going to be used internally by retrofit. So where is this retrofit thing? Where is it instantiated? How do we do that? Well, the beauty again is that we're going to use, or we've been using, the DI, dependency injection. That means then inside of our DI app module here, this is where we're going to create those providers that will allow for that dependency injection that we're talking about, which means we can then initialize certain classes or providers or dependencies that the app will need in the background to set everything up for us. But before we do that, we need to say at module to make sure that this indeed is a Dagger module. And then we're going to also set at install in Dagger like this. And I'm going to just pass a singleton component that class like this to set this app module class. So inside here, like I said, is where we set up all the app modules, the modules that are needed across the entire application to create things such as databases, in this case, also repositories, anything else that we need, that we know we need across the entire application, that we can create, instantiate the providers here, which then any part of the app can access it. So what do we want to do? Well, we want to create a provider, a way of providing the Open Weather API. So in this case, to instantiate retrofit, so it can use the base URL and pass this weather API that we created. Let's get rid of all this. So use our weather API and so forth. So very simply, close this down. All we do, look at this. I'm going to say at provides, right, to say that Dagger is going to provide the following statement or function. And also I'm going to make this a singleton. And then I'm going to say fun, say provide. Notice the naming, right? Remember, we're not going to use this function directly. Dagger and hilt dependency, module dependency, and everything in the background. It is what is going to get this information, or this function, call this function in the background, and create this dependency for us, right? So let's say provide open weather API, something like this. And of course, it's going to be instantiating, or it's going to be invoking the weather API, because that's what we need, right? As such. And then that's what I'm going to return in this case. I'm going to invoke the retrofit. Now I know that this is working because we have added a dependency. If you don't see that retrofit, then you know that dependency you didn't add the dependency. So go back to the previous video where I show you how to add those dependencies, or just go to the repo and get those dependencies. Very important. All right, that then builder, and then I'm going to continue adding a few things to our retrofit builder here. First of all, we need a base URL. Where do we get that? Well, we get it from our constants. Remember, our constants are actually there. Get the base URL. Very good. Next, I'm going to add a converter factory. This is important because retrofit needs to also convert all of that information, all of this JSON that we're getting here, into actual objects that we can be taken and used as objects, in a sense, Kotlin objects, right? So it's important to add this adapter factory, which we can use by saying JSON converter factory like that, and say that create, right? And then that build, and then let's not forget to say create. In order to create, we need to pass a model class per se, which is our weather API. So it knows exactly what to do when we are creating this provide open weather API, like that. This has to be add converter, there we go, factory like this. That's why it was giving me some issues. And there we go. Again, we are not ourselves going to call this provide open weather API. Dagger and hilt in the background, once we build and run this, it will know to create all the classes that it needs to create this dependency, to create, to retrofit all the classes in the background that needs to be used by retrofit, so that we can then, in conjunction with our weather API here, to be able then to say get weather and pass all of these parameters, all these queries, and indeed get this information here. As I have to add, they will be converted into JSON object, which essentially is going to be, in this case, Kotlin objects, right? So it's going to map everything with these object models that we created earlier there. That is the beauty of retrofit. And of course, in this case, dependency injection with hilt and dagger. Okay, so we have our app module, we have our weather app, API. Life is good. So it's time for us to look at the repository. Although repositories are not necessary, but it's always a good idea to have repositories, because then we can have one single source of truth, right? Where we have this layer of data where we can get from different places. So it's nice structural settings for especially when we're putting together or trying to get data. So we're going to create a repository here. It's just a class repository as such. Very well. So what is our weather repository going to do? Well, our weather repository going to do is it's going to allow us to get the data, but where from? Well, it's going to allow us to get the data directly from our, let's go to our network, our weather API, which means we are going to want to have access to this get weather, in this case, to implement this get weather function here, which incidentally, as you see, it's part of retrofit. So when we call this, retrofit will know how to handle it, because we'll ask for query, units if need be, app ID it's already retrieved or added, and then we're going to return a weather object, which again, if you remember, yes, it's all of this payload. So you can see all these building blocks coming together, hopefully. All right, we can just get rid of that real quick here. So now what we need to do, this is where the dependency injection really works, because now I can say at inject, I can inject certain dependencies, say inject such a constructor. I'm going to say private val, and it's going to be our API, which is our weather API as such. And so now I have access to this API, which is our weather API. So I can have access to indeed. So we can have access to the weather API. Again, if you go back, we have access to this get weather. Very good. So what we do inside here, well, this is where we do the work. This is where we actually get the weather. So I'm going to create another suspend function, and I'm going to say get weather. I can name whatever I want, but it's always customary to name the same names, so there's consistency there. And then here I'm going to pass a city, right? I'm going to say city query like this, and it's going to be a string, and then say units. It's also going to be a string. That suffices for now. And what is that I'm going to expect to receive? This is the question. Well, what I'm going to be expecting to receive, obviously, it's going to be a weather object. So I can say weather object as we created earlier. That's fine. But we want something more elaborate, because we want to be able to wrap this weather object into something a little bit more than just a weather object. What I mean by that is because we want to make sure that as this object, we get this weather object, this payload, we want to make sure to also add other metadata like the loading, if it's loading, if there's an exception, and so forth. So what we are going to do is we're going to create yet another class, right? Another wrapper class in our data here. It's very simple. And I'm going to call this data or exception. And the reason, like I said, is because we want to always be able to have a class that we can add more information regarding the process, which networking in this case, when we are dealing with receiving data from somewhere else, right? Internet or database, a file, and so forth. So it's always a good idea to create a wrapper class such as this, so we can pass information more than just that information that we are receiving. So this is going to include some generics. Now, generics is a huge topic. The idea is that I'm going to make this class so general in the sense that we can pass any type we want. So we're going to use T as a template, right? And then Boolean as such, and then E for exception. So what does that really mean? Well, it means that for our parameters here, I'm going to create var data. It's going to be of type T that we are passing, and can be null. It also means that our var, I can pass a loading parameter here, which is going to be a Boolean type, whether it's loading or not. And this can also be null. And I can pass another E for exception, just E like that. And it can also be null like this. Okay, and that's all. And I don't even need to have a body. So that just means now if I wrap anything in with our data or exception, I can pass, in this case, T, could be weather object, could be Paulo as an object, could be James, and so forth. And I can pass a Boolean. It will be interpreted as the loading. In this case, if it's true, that means it's loading. If it's not true, that means it's not loading, and so forth. So data now is going to be whatever we pass as a T here, whether object, as I said, or anything else. Exception is going to be E. We're going to pass as our arguments, and so forth. So now, instead of having this, I'm going to wrap this inside of our data or exception like that, which means I can now say for our data here, I'm going to pass our weather object, and we'll just pass any Boolean for loading and pass exception that we may get. Of course, we have a little problem here because we have to return something. All right, so now we do the work. So I'm going to say val response, we're expecting, put that inside of a try. There's a catch because things could happen. This is going to be exception. And what do we do here inside? Well, inside here, all I have to do, look how beautiful. I'm going to invoke the weather API, which I have access to because I'm using the dependency injection. We have injected the app weather API, which knows how to get data through retrofit. Wonderful. I'm going to say API as such. I'm going to say get weather, pass the query, which is a string. Where do I get that? It's just a city query like this. And then if something happens, sometimes things happen, here I'm going to say return data. Look at this. Inside here, I'm going to, for our E, which is indeed the exception, I'm going to say E is going to be equal to E, which is the exception. Now I am loading our data or exception wrapper class inside of its values, E, variable, or argument E. For exception is going to have the exception we receive if something happens. And else I'm going to return data or exception, and I'm going to pass inside of our data which accepts the type, which is our response. And this works because response is indeed a weather object that is needed. Right? Data response. There we go. Does that make sense? So now we've gained a lot. Notice that we can overload or add other metadata that we need, like exception, there it is, and we added data, response. So now when we get to call the get weather, we're going to expect this type, which will potentially, hopefully have the weather object, but most importantly, also we have the Boolean and exception if need be. So now that we have a repository, we could call directly and get that information, but what we're going to do, we're going to call or create a ViewModel because that's how we treat our data. We want to use a ViewModel to get that information onto our user interface. Now, where do we use that ViewModel? Well, where do we create that ViewModel? Well, our ViewModel is going to be inside of our screens. For now, I'm just going to create inside of our main here, create a new ViewModel. It's just a class called main ViewModel. And it's important to remember that this ViewModel, it's important to say it's a HILT ViewModel, like that, because we will need to do a few other things. I'm going to say at, also inject, because we need what? We need the repository, remember? So constructor, instead of public, let's just get rid of that. Make sure this is indeed a ViewModel. The problem is that I made this a Java class. Okay, my bad. Let's just get rid of that altogether. Should be more careful. Let's create Kotlin class. There we go. It's a class. Main view model. There we go. Make sure that is indeed a HILT view model. It's very important. Now it should work. So I'm going to say at inject, okay, constructor, private val, repository, weather repository as such. And let's not forget that this is indeed a view model. Say view model, Android lifecycle, like that. Okay. So now here, what we do is we create a structure that will allow us to get the information we want. So first, I'm going to create a val called data, and this is going to be a mutable state type of data or exception. Now, this is going to be very long, but it's okay. It's going to be a weather type object, I should say, right? Because we need to have that. It's going to be a Boolean, going to pass an exception like this, and then we're going to set it to something. So it's going to be mutable state of, and here I'm going to just say data or exception, and just pass, let's say null for the object, true for loading, and exception. I'm just going to create a simple exception here. Let's say exception, and pass in something like that. This has to be mutable state of. All right, there we go. So what I'm doing here, creating a variable that's going to be the correct type, right, which is data or exception, and we have to initialize it. But most importantly, we also wrap it around a mutable state. This has to be a state variable. Right, next I'm going to create an init block there, and I'm going to call load weather. Let's go ahead and create function load weather, and this load weather, all we is going to do is call get weather and pass, for instance, Seattle. And we haven't created that either. Let's go ahead and create that at the bottom there. Let's get city. Well, this is going to require a view model scope because we need that because we're going to be calling a suspend function. So view model scope, invoke launch, and inside here I can say if city that we're passing that is empty, right, then I'm just going to return nothing. Okay, in any other case I'm going to say data that value, and I'm going to set to the loading to true to say it is loading. And then data dot value. Okay, I'm going to use a repository. Look at this, and get weather, and then I'm going to pass city query. I'm going to pass the city as such, and I can say if data here that value that data again to get inside and get let's say toString is not empty, then I'm going to say data that value that loading is false. And of course I'm going to say log D here just to show you that something is happening, hopefully. Let's say data that value and data again toString, just to get the whole payload. Say get for the tag. So we did a lot of things. We created a view model here. We created a data object that's mutable state wrapped around a data or exception and so forth. We instantiated that. Has to be mutable state of. And then we have a neat block here which calls load weather, which in turn here, that's where we get the repository, call get weather, pass the query, which is the city, in this case Seattle, right? Here we do all the work. So what's happening also is that we are using the data, this guy here, mutable, and we're setting a few things. We're saying that the loading boolean is going to be true to say that it's loading. So in our front end, in our view, we can also look at it and say, okay, it's loading, which means we can show something to the user to let them know that something is loading, right? The data is being fetched. And then we're going to go and actually fetch the data. So, and set out to our data that value. Remember, data that value in this case is going to be this guy here, object, right? We're setting things up in our wrapper class. And we check if data is empty. That means the loading is finished. So loading is false, which means we can just get out of there. And for now, I'm just going to go ahead and see if we can get some data from our object, right? And log it. Very well. So hopefully we did everything right. In the next video, we're going to explore or call this main view model there and see if we can get some information.